Morning they escorted Nathan Briggs out of the Halcourt Freight terminal. It was raining, the kind of cold, sideways rain that comes off Lake Ontario in late October and makes everything feel heavier than it already is. He didn't make a scene. He just picked up the cardboard box they'd given him, nodded once at the security guard, a young kid named Tyler who'd been working the gate for only 3 months and who couldn't bring himself to make eye contact, and walked out through the loading dock entrance, past the row of trucks he'd spent 17 years keeping on the road. Nobody said anything. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Nathan Briggs was 44 years old. He had a daughter named Lily, who was 9, and who had made him a card that morning with a drawing of a truck on it because she knew trucks were his thing. The card was in the box, tucked under a coffee mug and a framed photo from the company's 15th anniversary dinner. He'd been named Fleet Operations Lead at that dinner. He remembered the handshake, the cheap wine, the way the regional VP had called him the backbone of this operation. That was 4 years ago. The new VP of Operations was a woman named Claire Ashworth. She'd come in from a consulting firm in Toronto 8 months earlier, full of frameworks and benchmarks and what she called scalable efficiency models. She was sharp. Nathan had recognized that immediately, and it hadn't been the problem. The problem was that she looked at Halcourt Freight's operation. 41 trucks, 3 depot locations across southern Ontario, a routing network that Nathan had spent the better part of a decade calibrating by hand, and saw a system built on one person's institutional memory rather than transferable process. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she was wrong enough. We're bringing in a specialized logistics consultancy, she'd told him 3 weeks before the termination, in a meeting that had also included HR and a woman from legal whose name Nathan never caught. Procedo Solutions. They've restructured freight operations for 12 companies in the last 5 years. Nathan had nodded. He'd asked a few questions. He'd kept his voice level. What he hadn't said, what he should have said, maybe, or maybe it wouldn't have mattered, was that Halcourt's routing network wasn't standard. It never had been. When he'd taken over fleet operations in 2007, the company had been bleeding money on 3 of its 7 regular corridors, losing hours to a combination of misread bridge weight limits on the 403 bypass, a fuel supplier arrangement in Hamilton that only worked if you sequenced your refueling stops in a specific order, and a depot in Brantford that technically existed but had effectively only one functional loading bay because the second one had a drainage problem that the landlord kept deferring. Nathan had learned all of this the hard way. Then he'd build workarounds, and the workarounds had become routine, and the routine had become invisible, which is what happens to all good operational knowledge eventually. It stops looking like knowledge and starts looking like how things are. He hadn't documented any of it, not because he was protecting himself. That genuinely hadn't been his motive, though he understood how it looked, but because the documentation had always seemed like tomorrow's problem, and there had always been more pressing things to do today. He drove home in the rain. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15. She was wearing her orange raincoat, the one with the broken zipper they kept meaning to replace, and she ran to the car and climbed in and immediately started telling him about a project on the St. Lawrence Seaway. "Did you know they built it in like 4 years?" she said. 4 years and the whole thing was done. And before that, boats had to go around. "I did know that," Nathan said. "Because of the locks." "Right." She looked at him. She was 9, but she had the eyes of someone who noticed things. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Bug. You look like when Grandpa's dog died." He laughed just once, through his nose. "I'm fine," he said again. "I'll tell you about it later." Later, over pasta and store-bought garlic bread, he told her he'd lost his job. He kept it simple. She listened the way she always listened, which was completely without interrupting. "But you know everything about the trucks," she said finally. "I know," he said. "So that's dumb." "Yeah," he said. "It kind of is." She thought about it for a moment, twirling her fork. "Is that why you have the box?" He glanced at the cardboard box sitting by the front door where he'd set it when they came in. "Yeah. Your mug is in there." "It is." "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she'd processed it and was moving on to problem-solving mode, which was very much her mother's trait, and it hit him every time. "I think you should start your own truck company." "That's a good long-term plan," he said. "Short-term, let me find another job first." She nodded, accepting this as reasonable. "Can we have ice cream?" He said yes. He always said yes to ice cream on bad days. He decided that was a parenting rule he could live with. Presido Solutions arrived on a Monday. There were 3 of them. A lead consultant named Jason Park, who was mid-30s and wore the kind of slim-fit suit that suggested he'd never personally loaded a freight pallet. A data analyst named Britt, who carried a laptop that never seemed to close, and a junior associate whose primary visible function was taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. They set up in the conference room that had previously been used for driver briefings and immediately requisitioned the wall-mounted whiteboard for what Jason Park called a process mapping exercise. Claire Ashworth sat in on the first session. She was pleased. The language Presidio used was the language she spoke: KPIs, throughput ratios, network optimization, asset utilization curves. It sounded like the operation was finally going to be understandable, legible. She had come from a world where you could put things on a slide and show them to a board, and Halcourt's operation, under Nathan Briggs, had always resisted that. It had lived in his head and in his hands and in 17 years of quiet adjustments, and she had found that frustrating in ways she hadn't fully examined. The first 2 weeks went well enough. Presidio mapped the existing routes, interviewed the drivers, and produced a 40-slide deck that used the phrase optimization opportunity 19 times. Claire circulated it to head office. There was enthusiasm. The trouble started in the 3rd week, on a Thursday morning in November, when 3 trucks out of the Brantford depot arrived at their delivery window in Kitchener 6 hours behind schedule. Jason Park pulled the GPS logs. The routing was fine. The trucks had followed the system exactly as Presidio had configured it. The problem was the 403 bypass, specifically the Powerline Road overpass, which had a posted weight limit of 8 tons, and which Nathan Briggs had known for 11 years could not, under any practical circumstances, handle a fully loaded Class 8 unit during the spring thaw or the late autumn freeze-thaw cycle, because the roadbed beneath it had a subsidence issue that the municipality had acknowledged but not repaired, and which caused the surface to shift just enough to make the structural tolerance unreliable. Nathan had known this because in 2012 a truck had cracked the road surface and they'd spent 3 weeks in correspondence with the region of Waterloo about liability before quietly rerouting all heavy loads to the airport road corridor instead. None of this was in any document. It lived in Nathan's head, and Nathan was no longer there. The trucks had been turned back by a transport officer who'd flagged the overpass. The detour had added 6 hours. The client, a mid-sized appliance manufacturer in Cambridge, had a hard delivery window for a retail partner, and they'd missed it. The retail partner had rejected the shipment. The appliance manufacturer was now on the phone with Claire Ashworth's counterpart at head office, and the conversation was not pleasant. Jason Park held an emergency session. He cross-referenced 3 different routing databases. He found no flag restriction on the Powerline Road overpass in any of them, which was technically accurate, because the restriction was informal, based on operational knowledge rather than official posting. He recommended a formal inquiry with the region of Waterloo. The second problem arrived the following Tuesday. It was the fuel sequencing. Halcourt had an arrangement with a family-owned fuel depot in Hamilton, a place called Morden Fuels, run by a man named Bill Morden, who was in his 60s and had been fueling Halcourt trucks since before Nathan had worked there. The arrangement was informal. Halcourt trucks got a preferred rate and priority service in exchange for consistent volume and always calling ahead before 6 a.m. It wasn't in any contract. Bill Morden operated on handshake terms, the way a certain generation of operators still did, and Nathan had maintained the relationship personally, calling Bill every few weeks, sometimes stopping in when he was doing a depot check. Presidio's routing optimization had adjusted the Hamilton corridor fuel stops to a different station, a larger, fully automated depot on the south side that offered a slightly better per-liter rate on paper. The informal arrangement with Morden Fuels quietly lapsed. Nobody called Bill. When 2 trucks on the Hamilton-Toronto run hit the new fuel depot on a Friday afternoon, they found it at capacity with a 4-hour wait, no priority arrangement, and no one to call. The automated system had no override. The drivers sat. They missed 2 time-sensitive pickups. One of those pickups was for a refrigerated medical supply chain that had a contractual temperature monitoring requirement, and the delay triggered a quality breach flag. Claire Ashworth took both incidents to head office. She framed them as implementation challenges, early-stage friction in a new system. Head office accepted this, provisionally, But the tone of the call made clear that provisional had a short timeline. Jason Park called another session. He started pulling on threads he couldn't explain. Why did certain routes perform differently than the model predicted? Why were some driver hours logging correctly and some weren't? Why did the Brantford Depot's afternoon throughput drop every time the temperature went below -10? That last one had a simple answer. The functional loading bay had a hydraulic lift that needed fluid top-ups more frequently in cold weather, and a manual workaround was to run it through a warm-up cycle before the afternoon shift. The drivers knew this. They'd been doing it for years, but it wasn't in any procedure document, which meant Presidio's efficiency model hadn't accounted for it, which meant their throughput projections were wrong on cold days in a way that compounded across the winter schedule. It was Britt, the data analyst, who finally said it out loud in a session that Claire Ashworth was not attending. "There's a layer of operational logic in the system that we don't have access to," she said. She had the kind of flat, honest manner of someone who was comfortable saying uncomfortable things. "It's not in the manuals. It's not in the driver logs. It's not in anything we were given, and it's load-bearing." Jason Park looked at her for a long moment. "You're saying someone took it with them." "I'm saying it was never written down, and the person who carried it isn't here." The room was quiet. "Who built most of this?" Jason asked. Nobody answered right away. Then the logistics coordinator, a woman named Patrice who had worked at Halcourt for 11 years and who had said very little during Presidio's entire engagement, said quietly, "Nathan Briggs. Most of the network logic, the supplier relationships, the depot workarounds. That was all Nathan." Another silence. "Is there any way to reach him?" Jason asked. Patrice looked at her hands. "You'd have to ask Claire." Claire Ashworth made the call herself. She'd thought about delegating it. She'd spent 2 days not thinking about it, and then 2 more days thinking about nothing else. She was not someone who found it easy to admit that she'd been wrong, not because she was arrogant. She didn't think of herself that way, but because she'd come into Halcourt with a mandate and a methodology, and the methodology was supposed to be the point. Nathan answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "this is Claire Ashworth." There was a pause. "Not long. I know who it is," he said. She prepared something, a framing, a professional way of explaining the situation. When she heard his voice, she set it aside. "We have a problem," she said. "Several problems, actually. And they all seem to trace back to knowledge that wasn't documented before you left." "I see," he said. "I'd like to bring you in, as a consultant, to help us map what we're missing." Another pause. "Claire," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name, and somehow that felt significant. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not sure that works for me." She hadn't expected that. People, in her experience, usually wanted to come back. The validation of being needed. "I understand if you need time to consider." "It's not about time," Nathan said. "It's about terms. If I come in, it's as an independent contractor, project basis. And the rate would need to reflect what the knowledge is actually worth, not what my salary was." She was quiet for a moment. "What rate are you thinking?" He told her. She did not agree right away. She took it to head office. When presented with the ongoing losses from the misrouted freight, the client friction, the medical supply chain flag, and the projected winter schedule impact of an unresolved Brantford hydraulic issue, agreed within 48 hours. Nathan drove to the terminal on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after he'd walked out through the loading dock. He parked in the visitor lot. He didn't use his old spot, and carried a single notepad and a thermos of coffee. He walked past the same security guard, Tyler, who this time did make eye contact, and looked faintly relieved to see him. The conference room was set up with Presidio's materials all over the walls. Jason Park and Britt were there. Claire Ashworth arrived 3 minutes later. They all looked at him with a mixture of professional composure and something that, in a different room, would have been called embarrassment. Nathan set down his thermos. "Okay," he said. "Let's start with the 403 bypass, and then we're going to talk about Bill Morden." He didn't say it with any edge. He wasn't performing anything. He just started talking, and as he talked, Britt typed, and Jason Park drew lines on the whiteboard, and the operational logic that had lived in Nathan Briggs's head for 17 years began, finally, to become visible. It took 4 full days. There was the overpass. There was more than fuels, and Nathan called Bill himself from the conference room and spent 12 minutes on the phone mostly listening while Bill talked about his grandson's hockey tournament. Before they'd re-established the arrangement, and Nathan had explained the new contact protocols so it wouldn't lapse again. There was the Brantford hydraulic lift, and 3 other depot-specific workarounds. Nathan walked them through one by one. There was a customs pre-clearance contact in Windsor, who handled a specific category of cross-border medical freight, and who only communicated by fax. Actual fax. The machine was still in the Brantford depot. Nathan showed them where, because that was what the contact preferred and it worked and there was no reason to change it. There was a section of Highway 6 north of Hamilton that had a seasonal weight restriction that wasn't posted online but appeared in a municipal bylaw supplement that Nathan had bookmarked in 2015 and never unbookmarked. Jason Park, to his credit, did not argue about any of it. He asked good questions. He was sharp, Nathan thought, in the way that Claire was sharp. Capable, rigorous, good at systems. He'd just been handed a map and not told that parts of the territory weren't on it. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Jason closed his laptop and looked at Nathan across the table. "How much of this did you build yourself?" he asked. "Most of the core routing logic," Nathan said. "The supplier relationships, all of them. The depot workarounds, yeah, those were mine. Some of it goes back to before me. The Windsor fax thing was already there when I arrived, I just maintained it." "And you never wrote any of it down?" Nathan thought about that. "I wrote bits of it. Nothing systematic. It was always the next thing I was going to do." He paused. "I don't think I fully understood how much of it was load-bearing until it wasn't there anymore." Jason nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," he said, "this is the most complex informal operational layer I've encountered in 12 years of doing this kind of work." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," Jason said. Then, after a moment, "But yeah." Claire Ashworth came in near the end of that 4th day. She had something she wanted to say, and she'd clearly been working out how to say it. "I want to acknowledge," she said, "that the transition process should have included a proper knowledge transfer. That was an oversight on my part." Nathan looked at her. She meant it. He could tell. "I didn't document it," he said. "That was on me too." She nodded once. Then, "Head office has asked me to pass along a question, whether you'd consider a longer-term advisory arrangement, not full-time. Project basis, your terms." Nathan had thought about this possibility. He'd thought about it during the drive-in and during the evenings while Lily was doing her homework at the kitchen table, and he was reading beside her. "I'll think about it," he said. "I'll let you know by end of week." He did think about it. He thought about it that night, making dinner while Lily sat on the counter and told him about a book she was reading where a girl discovers her whole town is secretly underground. "That's a lot to keep track of," Nathan said, stirring the soup. "She has a map," Lily said. "But the map is wrong in some places because it was made by someone who didn't explore the whole thing." Nathan looked at her. "That's a good book." "It's great," she said emphatically. He called Claire on Friday afternoon and gave her his answer. He would take the advisory arrangement, 2 days a month, at his rate, with a clause allowing him to exit with 30 days' notice and a requirement that everything he shared be documented properly this time, by Procedo in a format that wouldn't disappear if any one person left. Those were his terms. They accepted all of them. He wasn't going back to being the backbone they didn't know they needed. He was going to be something better than that. Someone whose knowledge was finally on paper, properly valued, and no longer invisible. He picked Lily up from school that afternoon. She was wearing the orange raincoat. The zipper was still broken. "Did you figure out the job thing?" she asked, climbing into the car. "Yeah," he said. "I figured it out." "Are you going to be okay?" "We're going to be more than okay, Bug." She considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old evaluating a serious claim. Then she clicked her seatbelt and said, "Can we get ice cream?" He laughed. A real one. Full and easy, the kind that had been rare for the past few weeks. "Yeah," Nathan Briggs said, "we can get ice cream." There's a moment near the end of Nathan's story that I keep coming back to. Not the part where the system collapsed, not the phone call where Claire had to ask for his help, but the part where he sat across from Jason Park on that 4th afternoon and said, quietly, "I don't think I fully understood how much of it was load-bearing until it wasn't there anymore." That line does something to me every time I think about it, because it's honest in a way that's rare. It would have been easy and human for Nathan to point fingers, to let the consultants flounder a little longer, to feel righteous about being called back, and nobody would have blamed him. But that's not what he did. He showed up with a notepad and a thermos and started talking, because the work mattered more to him than the score did. That's not weakness. That's the kind of character that takes years to build and one hard moment to prove. I think about what it means to do right by people even when they haven't done right by you. Nathan called Bill Morden himself. From their conference room, he re-established the relationship, asked about the grandson's hockey tournament, sorted out the new contact protocol so the same mistake couldn't happen again. He didn't have to do any of that. He could have written a note and handed it off, but he understood something that efficiency frameworks rarely capture. That some working relationships are built on trust accumulated over years, and trust doesn't transfer through a slide deck. It transfers through a phone call, through showing up, through remembering that there's a person on the other end. That's integrity, not the word on a poster, but the actual thing. Doing what's right when it costs you something, when no one would notice if you didn't. And then there's the intelligence Nathan brought to that table. Not the flashy kind. He wasn't the person in the room with the best presentation. He was the person who knew which overpass couldn't handle a loaded truck in a freeze-thaw cycle, and why, and what the workaround was, and who to call in Windsor, and that the fax machine was behind the second door on the left in Brantford. That knowledge was invisible until it disappeared. The lesson there isn't just about documentation. It's about the kind of deep, patient, accumulated understanding that only comes from actually caring about your work for a long time. From paying attention when it would have been easier not to. From treating every route and every supplier relationship as something worth knowing properly, not just well enough. In the resilience, I keep thinking about Nathan driving home in that sideways October rain, picking Lily up from school, sitting across from her at dinner and telling her simply that he'd lost his job. No collapse, no bitterness, just honesty, and then pasta, and then ice cream because some days call for it. The willingness to keep going, to protect his kid from panic while still being truthful with her, to hold himself together long enough to figure out the next step. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. I think the three of those things together, doing right by people, thinking carefully and deeply, and getting back up, are what carried Nathan through. Not luck, not revenge, not a dramatic confrontation where someone finally admitted they were wrong, just a man who knew what he knew who he was, and refused to let either of those things get smaller just because someone underestimated them. Lily told him, over dinner the night he figured it out, that the girl in her book had a map with wrong parts, because the person who made it hadn't explored the whole thing. Nathan laughed at that. I think he recognized himself in it. The map he'd built, the parts he'd left blank, and the long, unglamorous work of finally filling them in. Some things only become visible when they're gone. The best we can do is make sure that, when we're asked to come back and explain them, we show up,